Hello, I am Brendan Long, a Senior Research Fellow at Charles Sturt University, and welcome to my sixth podcast called The Long View. The Long View is a series of podcasts devoted to looking at the economics of the COVID crisis, also its social effects, particularly with a focus on the Canberra region, but also with a focus on areas of economic disadvantage. And my guest today is, again, a very welcome guest, and that is Professor Brenton Prosser, who is the director of NATSEM, which is the National Centre for Economic Modelling, Social and Economic Modelling, National Centre for Social and Economic Modelling. And he's here to discuss some new and interesting research that NATSEM has produced, which helps us to analyse the social effects and economic effects of COVID in a timely way. Thank you for joining us today, Brenton.
My pleasure to be back.
We had the pleasure of Brenton's company on an earlier podcast, which was interesting, and we're really developing those themes here today. So, Brenton, what is the nature of this new research that NATSEM has been able to produce?
Yeah, what we've attempted to do is an approach called nowcasting, where we're trying to bring together different forms of data from the period that relates just before and after COVID and get a snapshot of what the impact's been on the economy, particularly household incomes. What's particularly challenging for policymakers is the way that data is collected and released. It can sometimes take up to 2 years before data is publicly available. So that's a long time to wait for a policymaker. So the nowcasting approach that we've used has actually sought to capture data from between February and June this year, so just before the COVID impact, and then right through to the middle of the year.
So often you have to, historically, looking at distributional data, it's my experience that you rely on some of the ABS surveys. House surveyed income and housing is one of the better ones, but it's been a long while between drinks for that survey, I think, hasn't it?
Yes, and I think the last release of that is 2018. So if we're waiting for today's data to come out, it'll be potentially 2022. So what we did in the nowcasting approach was we took the monthly labour force figures, which, as you know, unemployment is based around, although that doesn't tell you income. We looked at the weekly one-tap payroll records that the ABS sharing with the ABS. And then what we took out of the social income and housing data is I suppose the composition of the particular figures. And what I mean by that is we didn't look at the volatile things that might have been changed, but the relationship between different pay groups, likelihood to be first to be unemployed, those sorts of things. You can still predict that because enterprise agreements and labour conditions aren't changing as fast as some of the data. And then we combine it with NATSEM's StinMod modelling, which is our tax transfer and welfare payment tool. And together, these four things enabled us to produce a picture of what's happening with household income in the period to February to June this year.
So it's interesting that you can get the, you can do with the unemployment series through the labour market series, but you're able to. How do you sort of cross-tabulate the labour market data against income data to be able to find out the distributional effects? That sounds like an innovative technique.
Yes, and it is, and it's a formula that we developed that basically it seeks to, with a high level of reliability, model and then test. So we actually tested back against the unemployment figures and found that our modelling results sat pretty much in between what we were seeing on that, what we would expect on the household survey, which is the one that's less current in the ABS data. So yes, our team, I mean, I'd have to get our specialist, Professor Jinjing Li, talking through the specific formula, but we took special efforts to make sure that the modelling actually fits within the realms of what we know are reliable results.
Yeah, no, it's just interesting to be able to use to try to find an innovative way to update an original ABS series. So that sounds interesting, using current labour market.
Well, as you know with modelling, it's always an approximation, and so we could do this every month with the payroll data, but we're more likely to do it,
or even every fortnight.
Do it every 3 months. Yeah. But again, you need a little bit of length to see the change, and the most significant change we saw was the Gini index, which measures income inequity. That changed 0.03 in 3 months. Now, to put that in context, the Gini index would normally change 0.01 in a year. So we saw more change in 3 months than we would normally see in 3 years. And this would have to largely come down to the government's policies around childcare, JobKeeper and JobSeeker.
Interesting. Do we get a sense from the data whether there's any one cohort that seems to be more affected by the economic effects of COVID? I'm thinking in particular sole parents, whether they're the ones that are bearing the burden more significantly than other cohorts. Is there any insights from the data into those different family type compositions?
We haven't dug down into the demographic data at this stage. What we've done is we've looked at it in quintiles, and so the hardest hit quintile is actually the second quintile, so the bottom 20 to 40%. So they had so in terms of unemployment, so March and April and May were probably the biggest hit for unemployment, and so quintile 1, the bottom 20%, had about 10% job losses, while quintile 2 had around 14% of job losses. The rest of the population had around 3 to 6%. By June, that had begun to plateau back out. So the bottom 2 quintiles have come back down to 10%, and the rest are at 5%. But in terms of household income, we were predicting that the bottom quintile would go down 3 to 4%, and the second bottom would go down about 10%. But instead, what was the bottom quintile went up by 24%, while the remainder went up by 8.4%. So it's quite a dramatic turnaround when you think that it's going from a negative to swing back to the positive. Our supposition around why quintile 2's probably had the biggest hit is because there are members in quintile 1 that are already receiving welfare payments, and some can actually buffer some of the impact. But a little bit higher up, you're feeling the full impact of losing your job.
That's interesting. So but these people are still not wealthy people in the second quintile. So this is like people around about $45,000 a year, something like that, probably. But they're low wage people on minimum, on low, for example, retail workers, that sort of person. Would be in this category, or part-time workers, part-time. Sole parents, I would have thought. The
tourism industry was in there. Interestingly, the growth industries were around facilities and home services and technology. So I think it's got to do with people being home more and spending more on utilities and services at home. But the other interesting one was actually a decline in the health and social services sector, which one might have thought might increase with the demand. But it could be that people have been putting off services because of the concern of the potential contact with someone and contracting COVID. So there's some interesting questions to be thought through around the different patterns, even within the changes in the income by industry.
So the STP, it's interesting to use the STP date, that's touch payroll database within the ATO. I look at this every fortnight. It comes out every second Tuesday, as you know. And to be able to use that to, unpack the distribution impacts, quite novel, because as you know, that doesn't happen with the ABS's data. They just produce you employment. They do produce wage data, but it's just as an aggregate wage bill spend and a number of payroll jobs. So I think what's innovative is to be able to then drill that down to the where you've got the level of actual income cohorts. So how are the top cohorts going?
It's all relative. They've taken a hit, yes, but they have in cash terms, the hit is sometimes larger, but it's actually the proportion of income they had as a buffer. So that no quintile's been untouched. That's to be quite clear. But at the quintile 4 and quintile 5, there tends to be more resources for people to mitigate for the impact.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
but it's certainly the case. Yeah. But I mean, the interesting thing about the approach is nowcasting's been used in Europe, Italy, UK quite extensively, and with COVID. But what's been unique around our approach is that the capacity to bring together the survey of income and housing, the monthly labour force to kind of get a unique Australian response. So it's been a very pragmatic, well, technically sound. It's been a very pragmatic way of looking at what have we got, what we can use and be innovative.
Yeah, and so and also timeliness is the thing. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that there's much use in doing too much retrospective about what happens, 2 years away, looking back and telling us what we should be doing now. This is the sort of time when policymakers need to have guidance as to what is the scope of the economic effect. I mean, I am worried about the step down that happens today in JobKeeper and JobSeeker, but JobKeeper in particular. Clearly, some of these numbers that you're presenting are reflecting the income stimulus of JobKeeper in its current form. Now, your next run, whenever that is, Brenton, will be really interesting, because then you'll be modelling the step down in JobKeeper, and then we'll really know how bad quintile 2 is really going to be hit. What do you expect to happen in your next analysis?
Well, I mean, we're very careful to talk about what we know rather than predict and speculate, particularly when policy settings are changing by the day and we've got a budget in a couple of weeks. But it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that if there's been the increase of 3 years in 3 months, if those measures were to be reversed, things would go the other way. Now, the government may have other policy initiatives in mind, but if you just base it on the data that we looked at, to see such a significant jump, for things to be phased back, you would assume they would go back the other way, and income inequity would return to previous levels.
Yeah, and or return to previous levels or fall below previous levels?
Well, that's. I mean, we'll be probably every couple of months we'll be coming back, and we'll be having this tool to be able to take a snapshot and say to policy leaders, okay, decisions that have been made are made for a range of reasons, not just economic modelling, but we can tell you that this is what's happened over the last few months, and you can see the impact of those decisions.
Yeah, so that's the interesting one. Like, we tell government whether JobKeeper Mark 2, JobKeeper in its current now form in September after September 28 today, whether that really has been able to not just keep people in jobs, but has also keep people out of poverty. And that's what your research can show. Sort of, if you were to say the analysis so far, I mean, would you say that your research probably indicates that JobKeeper in its form as it was last night, has had a pretty material impact overall in sustaining people who could otherwise be vulnerable from the full effects of the COVID crisis? I mean, what's your data show about JobKeeper so far? Does it give it a pretty good tick?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the important thing to note is that we fused all three, the JobKeeper, JobSeeker and the childcare subsidy together. And that's the nature of how the StinMod model works.
Yeah.
It takes, its power is in its integration, because if you shift a threshold at one place, it'll have impacts at other parts of the welfare payment system. So we didn't delineate each of the policy measures out individually. So I think it's fair to say, that JobKeeper and JobSeeker is likely to have a larger impact on the lower quintiles. And maybe the childcare subsidy had more impact on more evenly across the board. But I can't give you a definitive answer because of the way the model worked actually combined. I mean, and there was also changes around looking for work requirements. There's a range of other things that were part of the government's response.
Sure. What will be interesting too, and I suppose we should conclude here, is I'm worried about how participation requirements under the new regime for job seeker are going to work. There are no jobs out there for people, unless there may be some jobs in certain specialised sectors. But if you're in Victoria, it'd be very, very hard to find anyone. It'd be very hard to be able to work. So I'm worried. It'll be interesting to see whether if there's any effect of the mutual obligation requirements, and whether that shows up at all in your next data set. I know you don't model necessarily. Well, actually, does NATSEM actually focus on particular unemployment benefit cohorts? So, for example, particularly people who we would have traditionally described as in the New Start cohort or the youth allowance unemployed cohort. I think the STINMOD does actually capture those populations, doesn't it?
Yes, and we also have geospatial mapping that we use.
Yeah.
So that can convert from LGA, SA4 postcode to a consistent SA2, and then map, and that opens up possibilities around a whole range of demographic groups and synthesizing data. So certainly we've done mapping around economic disadvantage, health access, where we break it down into the different demographic groups. STINMOD does some of that, but to get the full demographic picture, you have to integrate it with other data sets. So that's something we would be looking to do down the track. But clearly, different policies have impacts on different groups in the community. One of the groups that I'm particularly interested in is regional Australia, and regional towns or cities that have been dependent on one industry. And that industry has ceased, and they've been sustained through JobKeeper and JobSeeker. But what happens when JobKeeper and JobSeeker cease or transition out? What happens to those towns? And it's not just the workers; it's the partners that may be working in service industries and that sort of thing. So I think there's a real challenge for potentially for regional Australia. And so mapping is a really interesting way to have a look at how things play out differently in different places. And we know that the impact of this has been very different, even within or between suburbs of Canberra.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And the only thing to conclude then is, I'm taking interest in Canberra in particular as an economist in the region, but I've noticed that Canberra's unemployment rate, according to not unemployment rate, Canberra's payroll job rate, according to the single touch payroll system released last Tuesday, shows that from the 14th of March, the beginning of COVID, until now, there are 4.5% less payroll jobs than there were previous to COVID to 14th of March. Now that's way on the national average there, right on the national average at 4.5%. Wages have fallen by 2.8% compared to 4.3% nationally. That's in the ACT. So there's been, obviously, wages haven't fallen. The wage bill hasn't fallen in the ACT, but employment has. So that's interesting because you'd think that we would have been more insulated because of the public sector. But what that really must be showing is that the private sector in the territory is taking a fairly substantial hit. And if you've got the national average at the same, but you've got a massive public sector that's insulated, you could even argue that the private sector in Canberra might be taking an even bigger hit than the national average. So in terms of employment, that is. So anyway, that's Brenton Prosser. Yeah.
That caught our attention in the NATSEM office, and we had a chat about it. And one of the things we noted is those payroll figures can be one-off, a bit volatile. So there's always a bit of caution, but I still take the point. I think one of the things that's interesting about that Canberra may be a fairly stable town in terms of, universities and public sector, but there's actually a lot of associated jobs with those that are more vulnerable. So if we just think of the university context, there's been some publicity about academics losing work, but before that conversation starts, there's a whole lot of part-time casual sessional work that would be teaching that's gone already, that hasn't been put in place this year. If you think about the retail on the university sites without any students at all, the cafes and all those sort of are struggling to stay afloat. So even though our core industries may be relatively stable, there's a lot of secondary work that remains quite vulnerable.
Yeah, I imagine the cafes and Civic must have been struggling with none of those international students. But anyway, now, Professor Prosser, it is always a pleasure to engage with you. Thank you for joining me and joining us on The Long View.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.